King Edmund of Valmore had made up his mind, and for a man who had spent 30 years learning patience, that was itself unusual. The document sat on his private desk in the regent's study, 3 pages of formal language drafted by the Crown's own solicitors, authorizing the permanent transfer of Ashcombe House, the monarch's official residence for state visits and ceremonial functions, into the lifetime possession of Queen Consort Isolde. All that remained was his signature. He had chosen the pen. He had chosen the hour. He had not, however, told his son. Crown Prince Alaric found out by accident, the way most palace secrets eventually surface, through a junior clerk who mentioned, almost in passing, that renovation contractors have been asked to submit private suite proposals for Ashcombe House once the transfer is finalized. Alaric asked when the transfer was expected. The clerk, sensing too late that he had said something he shouldn't have, simply said, "Any day now, I believe. The king has already selected the residence." Alaric did not raise his voice. He did not summon an emergency meeting of the household staff. He put down the papers he had been reviewing, walked the length of the east corridor, and entered his father's study without being announced. King Edmund looked up, more startled than annoyed. "Alaric, I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not," the prince said. His eyes moved to the unsigned document on the desk. "Is that Ashcombe?" The king's hand moved instinctively toward the page, not to hide it, but as if to protect something fragile. "It is. You've chosen to give it to Isolde. Permanently, without consulting the council." "I am the king," Edmund said, and there was no anger in it, only the quiet certainty of a man who believed the matter was already settled. "I do not require the council's permission to make a gift to my wife." Alaric crossed the room and placed his palm flat against the document, not violently, not even quickly, the way a man might rest his hand on a closed door rather than force it open. "You do when the gift belongs to the crown and not to you." It was such a small gesture, a hand on paper. But the king would later say, to almost no one, that it was the most forceful thing his son had ever done to him, precisely because it had cost Alaric nothing to do it gently. Word of the confrontation reached Queen Isolde before any formal explanation did, which was, in its way, the cruelest part. An aide found her in the East Gallery, mid-conversation about drapery fabric for what she had already begun calling, privately, my rooms. The aide's face told her something was wrong before he said a single word. "The transfer has been paused, Your Majesty. The Crown Prince, he's asked that no residence be reassigned without a formal vote of the estate's council." Isolde did not gasp. She did not demand to see her husband. She thanked the aide, dismissed him with a small nod, and walked, not hurried, not slow, to her private sitting room, where she closed the door and stood very still for a long moment before she allowed herself to feel anything at all. She had already imagined which room would become her study. She had already imagined the mornings. To understand why Alaric had done what he did, it helps to understand what Ashcombe House actually was, not merely a grand building with tall windows and old gardens, but a working piece of the monarchy's machinery. Its upkeep, its security detail, its ceremonial staff, its very existence as a functioning residence, were paid for through crown funds set aside specifically for the sovereign's official duties, not the sovereign's private life. A king could gift his wife jewelry. He could gift her land he personally owned. He could not, by long custom if not always by explicit law, simply hand over a property that belonged to the office of the monarchy itself, to be held forever by someone who might one day no longer be married to whoever sat on the throne. Alaric had prepared for this conversation longer than his father realized. He arrived not only with objections but with a formal briefing, pages outlining precisely how Ashcombe's costs were tied to the crown estate, how a permanent private transfer would obligate future reigns to fund a residence they had never chosen to give away, and how no such transfer had ever occurred in the kingdom's modern history without the estate's council's recorded approval. "This isn't about Isolde," he told his father, once the door was closed and it was only the two of them. "It's about what happens the reign after yours, and the reign after that. If you can give Ashcombe away on a private promise, so can I. So can whoever comes after me. Where does it end?" "It ends with my wife having a home she cannot be stripped of," Edmund said. "Do you understand what it has cost her all these years to be tolerated rather than accepted? I wanted to give her something no one could ever take back." And there it was, the wound beneath the argument. Edmund had spent the better part of 2 decades watching his wife smile through rooms that did not quite belong to her, applauded by crowds who were not always certain they meant it. He wanted, more than he wanted almost anything else in his reign, to hand her permanence. Alaric did not think his father was wrong to want that. He thought his father was wrong to think a crown property was his to give. Princess Rosalind, the king's sister, had not been told any of this was happening. Neither had several other members of the family, whose formal consent the transfer would eventually have required. Only a small, trusted circle had seen the draft authorization before Alaric intervened, which was, Alaric came to believe, not an accident. If the plan had been straightforward, it would not have needed to be quiet. When Rosalind finally learned what had almost happened, she went looking for something she had kept locked in a private drawer for years. A memorandum, handwritten in part by the late Queen Mother, dated more than a decade earlier, following a dinner at which, in an eerie echo of the current crisis, Edmund had once promised, in a moment of tenderness, that Isolde would always have a home worthy of her devotion. The old Queen Mother had heard that promise and said nothing to her son directly. Instead, she had written down a single instruction meant for whoever needed it someday. No official residence of the crown is to be reassigned permanently to any individual, including a spouse of the sovereign, without full consultation and a recorded vote. Generosity must never be mistaken for ownership. Rosalind had kept the memorandum sealed away, unused, because no transfer had ever actually been attempted while their mother lived. Now it was needed. She brought it to Alaric without ceremony, in a plain folder, and said only, "Your grandmother knew this day would come." I don't know how, but she knew. Alaric read the handwritten line twice. Then he asked Rosalind to come with him to see the king. The second conversation between father and son was not private, not entirely. Rosalind stood near the window, present but silent, a witness rather than a participant. Edmund recognized his mother's handwriting before he had finished the first sentence, and something in his posture changed. The way a man's shoulders drop when an argument he thought he was winning suddenly reveals itself to have already been settled, years ago, by someone wiser than him. "She never told me this," Edmund said quietly. "She told Rosalind," Alaric said. "She trusted it would be needed eventually, and not while she was here to enforce it herself." Edmund did not sign the document that day, but neither did he tear it up. Instead, in a decision that surprised both his son and his sister, he ordered the matter placed before the estate's council, the formal body responsible for exactly this kind of dispute, rather than resolving it alone in either direction. "If the council agrees with me," he said, "then I will have given Isolde what she deserves, properly, with the institution's full backing. And if they don't," he stopped, "then at least it will have been decided honestly." The council chamber, when it convened 3 days later, held none of the theater the public would later imagine. There were no raised voices, no dramatic walkouts. There was simply a long table, a stack of numbered documents, and a question that everyone in the room understood mattered far beyond the specific walls of Ashcombe House. Could a sitting monarch use the machinery of the crown to fulfill a private, personal promise? Several senior officials proposed a middle path, a renewable arrangement that would let Isolde occupy Ashcombe House for as long as Edmund remained king, without granting permanent private ownership. Alaric and Rosalind pushed for firmer language, worried that any ambiguity would simply be exploited later. A cousin of the king's, Prince Dorian, tried to broker something in between. Full use and dignity for Isolde during Edmund's reign, paired with an explicit, written return of the property to unrestricted crown use the moment that reign ended. It was this proposal, ultimately, that Alaric endorsed, not because it gave him what he wanted, but because it did not humiliate the woman at the center of it, while still protecting the principle he had walked into his father's study to defend in the first place. "I'm not trying to take anything from her," Alaric told the council plainly. "I'm trying to make sure that what she's given can't quietly become something my children, or their children, are forced to defend forever without ever having agreed to it." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Isolde would retain full use of Ashcombe House, its staff, its protection, its dignity, for as long as Edmund sat on the throne. Ownership, and any question of what happened afterward, would remain permanently with the crown. Isolde received the news not through a triumphant announcement, but through a quiet, almost apologetic briefing from the king himself, delivered in her private sitting room with no aides present. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question, and it was not the question he had braced himself for. Did you ever actually have the power to promise it to me? Truly. Edmund did not answer immediately, and the silence answered for him. No, he admitted finally. I don't think I did. I think I wanted to so badly that I convinced myself I did. She did not respond with anger, though she might have been entitled to it. Instead, she said something that stayed with him longer than any argument could have. A promise made without the power to keep it feels wonderful for exactly as long as you don't know that. And then it doesn't. It was Princess Alara, Alaric's wife, who first suggested that the wound between Isolde and Alaric needed to be addressed directly and not left to heal or fester on its own. She had watched her husband grow more withdrawn in the days after the council vote, not because he doubted his decision, but because he had begun to understand that being right and being kind were not always the same accomplishment. You protected the institution, Alara told him one evening. That doesn't mean you didn't also hurt her. Both of those things can be true. You should tell her that you know it. Alaric requested a private meeting with Isolde. No advisors, no prepared statements, nothing that could later be repeated by a secretary or summarized in a palace release. Isolde agreed on one condition, that whatever was said between them in that room would stay there. He found her standing near an unlit fireplace, arms loosely folded, none of the composed formality she wore in public. She did not ask him to undo the council's decision. She asked him something far more direct. Did you ever intend for me to feel like I belonged here? Or was I always going to be temporary to you, no matter what happened with that house? Alaric considered the question seriously before answering, because it deserved that. I never wanted you to feel unwelcome, he said. I think I made the mistake of treating your place in this family like a political question instead of a human one. I was so focused on precedent and consequence that I didn't think enough about what it's actually like to live your whole life, depending on other people's goodwill. It was, Isolde admitted, the first time anyone in the family had said that to her plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable. She told him in turn what she had never told even Edmund in full, that Ashcombe House had never really been about the house. It had been about proof that if her husband's health failed, if the political winds shifted, if the family's affection for her ever cooled, she would still have somewhere that was unquestionably hers. The fear beneath the fight was not vanity. It was the particular loneliness of a person whose security depends entirely on other people continuing to choose her. Alaric did not have the power to give her permanent ownership of a crown residence, but he offered something else. His support for a separate, privately funded lifetime residence for her, established through personal royal resources rather than institutional property. Something that would be unambiguously hers, that no future reign, no future council, no future doubt about her could ever touch. Isolde was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, simply, that would have been enough from the beginning. The public, inevitably, learned a version of events long before the family had finished working through them privately. A leaked summary of the council's decision reached a newspaper within 2 days, and the headline that ran the following morning, Crown Prince blocks Queen Consort's royal home, was, like most headlines, both technically accurate and almost entirely misleading. Commentators split predictably. Some framed Alaric as a cold institutionalist who had humiliated a woman for the crime of wanting security. Others framed him as a future king demonstrating, years before his coronation, that he understood the difference between personal generosity and institutional obligation. Almost no one in the early coverage seemed to have room for the more complicated truth, that both Edmund's impulse and Alaric's caution had come from real, defensible places, and that the two men had simply been standing on different sides of the same unresolved question about what a monarchy actually owes to the people who serve it. Edmund, reading the coverage over breakfast, folded the newspaper before Isolde could see the front page. She had already read it the night before. You don't have to protect me from it, she told him. I've had worse said about me. This time, at least, the story isn't a lie. It's just incomplete. The formal resolution, when the palace finally released it, was almost anticlimactic in its plainness. Ashcombe House would remain permanently attached to the crown, available for Isolde's full use during Edmund's reign, with any future reassignment requiring the same council consultation and recorded vote that had just taken place. A separate statement, issued quietly and without much fanfare, confirmed that a private lifetime residence for the Queen Consort had been established through personal, non-crown resources, hers, unconditionally, regardless of what happened to the throne afterward. It was not the dramatic ending anyone following the story from the outside might have expected. There was no triumphant reconciliation staged for cameras, no single photograph that resolved months of tension into a tidy narrative. What there was, instead, was smaller and perhaps more durable. At the next state reception, Edmund entered with Isolde beside him and Alaric a step behind, and for a brief moment the king turned, looked at his son, and gestured him forward to walk alongside them both. It was a small thing, but everyone who understood what had happened in the weeks before understood exactly what it meant. Alaric had not tried to take his father's place. He had tried to protect the place itself, the office, the institution, the long chain of obligations that would eventually be his to carry, even when doing so meant standing, uninvited, in a room where he was not entirely welcome. And in the end, it was that same instinct turned toward a woman he had once treated as a political problem rather than a person that allowed the family to find something more honest than the arrangement they had started with. Edmund would later say, to almost no one, that being stopped by his own son had felt, in the moment, like the sharpest loss of authority of his reign. Alaric's answer, when his father finally said as much to him directly, was simple. Staying silent would have cost you more, eventually. I just made sure it cost you now, while there was still time to fix it. The king did not entirely forgive the sting of that moment, but he came in time to agree with it. And Isolde, walking into Ashcombe House some weeks later, not as its owner, but as a woman trusted with its care for as long as she remained its queen, asked that one room be set aside to honor the consorts who had lived there before her. It was not the permanence she had once wanted. It was, she found, something steadier, a place she was certain of, built not on a promise one man could not actually keep, but on an agreement that everyone who mattered had actually chosen.